Hello, it's Martin from Wisely Automotive, and you join me in this BMW i3 as we are heading into winter. So I thought it would be an appropriate time to show you some tips and tricks on how to get the most out of the vehicle in these cold weather conditions. Because I see this all the time during handovers. When people are cold, they instinctively reach for the controls, crank up the heat and the fan. But that's completely wrong. And don't you worry, I will go beyond the usual tip of using your heated seats to stay warm. Having said that, if you're new to electric cars, it's the most crucial tip because it's the easiest way of squeezing out more range out of your vehicle without compromising much on comfort. That's because with the cabin heating, unlike with a combustion engine vehicle, of course, it is powered by electricity and it's heating up the air in the entire cabin, whereas with heated seats, they are heating your body directly. So let's actually quantify this. I've got an OBD dongle plugged in the i3 and connected to my iPad. And when the car was fully cold, the moment I started the heater, it was pulling just over 5 kilowatts, whereas now at the steady state, it is using about 2.5 kilowatts. That still means that if you were stuck in a completely stationary traffic jam and only using the heating, an i3 like this with the biggest 120 amp hour battery would still survive between 10 and 15 hours from a full charge all the way to empty, so you do not have to worry about that side of things. But to illustrate the difference, if I completely shut off the heating, in a moment the power on the OBD readout will drop to about 300 watts or 0.3 of a kilowatt, and that's because we have got still some systems running in the background on the 12-volt network, like the head unit powering the sat-nav system, instrument cluster, lights, etc. The moment I turn on my heated seat on full strength, starting from cold, the power consumption will jump by about 200 watts at maximum. The same thing if I turn on the passenger side as well. So with relying purely on the heated seats running at maximum power, you can be stuck in this car for well over a day and still have charge left. By the way, the heated seats should run for as long as you wish, although they may automatically lower the amount of power they draw for safety reasons. If yours keep shutting off on their own even after a short while, that's a fault which generally requires a new seat pad, which includes the heating element, the thermostat, etc. A job we do regularly and one we can complete right on your driveway. Next up, let's get back to the HVAC, the heating, ventilation, air conditioning system. Because of course in wintertime your windows may be misting up, you still want to be generally comfortable even on your hands. There's no heated steering wheel option on the i3, so you will probably want to heat the cabin air as well. I will turn off the seats for now, but I'm not exaggerating that settings like these are completely wrong. And it's exactly where I see people get confused, especially if they're coming from older vehicles. Because in the winter time, you want to set your temperature to be lower than in the summertime when you would expect cooling. Let me explain. Firstly, I would highly recommend running the air conditioning or heating always in fully automatic mode, and then adjusting the temperature like a house thermostat. It's important to mention, once you go into automatic mode, the whole logic of the AC system changes. Because you're not adjusting the temperature of the air coming out of the air vents, you are adjusting the target temperature of the entire cabin. The i3 is a very clever vehicle. There are multiple temperature probes, humidity and condensation sensors, as well as a solar radiation sensor. So it can, for example, compensate for sun shining directly into the cabin in the middle of summer versus it being quite gloomy during winter. And that's the reason why I personally like to have the cabin temperature set around 18-19 degrees Celsius in winter time, especially on short journeys, because if I'm wearing a jacket, imagine wearing a jacket in your house where it's 20-21 degrees. You would be way too hot. So an air temperature of 18 degrees is plenty enough to keep the windows from misting up, to keep your hands from freezing, and it's also very energy efficient for the vehicle. For example, right now the ambient temperature in this car park is just over 14 degrees Celsius, yet the HVAC is barely pulling any power. The OBD readout has stabilized at about 800 watts. It also means I do not have to constantly fumble with the settings, which is particularly important for the newer BMW vehicles and all modern cars in general, which have some of the HVAC settings in the infotainment system rather than with physical dials and switches. Because now with the cabin at the target temperature of 19 degrees Celsius, the fan speed has automatically ramped down and the air coming out of the air vents is roughly the same temperature as the cabin. Whereas the moment you start the car, even if it's freezing outside, the fan will automatically kick up to a higher setting, and so will the heating, to make sure that the cabin gets to that even desired temperature in reasonable time. If you want to speed up the process further, rather than cranking the temperature, with BMWs you can adjust how aggressive the fan can be even in fully automatic mode. And the way that you can tell that you are controlling the aggressiveness of the auto mode is by the fact that only one fan line is illuminated, and of course the auto symbol is illuminated, whereas if I turn off auto, this is where you are now in manual HVAC mode. Going back into auto, the other thing which you may find counterintuitive is that despite wanting heating, the air conditioning symbol is illuminated, and this is very much on purpose. You see, with AC most people translate it as cooling, so it's used for summertime, but I recommend leaving AC on all the time, because if the car doesn't need it in automatic mode, the AC compressor is shut off and you just get ventilation. However, in wintertime, especially after a long cold night, or if it's raining and you get in and there is increased humidity in the cabin, the air conditioning, as the name suggests, helps condition the air, in other words, dry it out to a comfortable humidity level. And that's not only for comfort, to help with demisting the windows quicker, but also once again with energy efficiency, because dry air is less energetically expensive to heat than humid air. From the mechanical point of view, it also helps to keep all the seals and components within the air conditioning system lubricated, so it's definitely not worth shutting off in the long run. On this point, i3s could be optionally equipped with the heat pump. However, there is no way to control the heat pump through the panel or through the infotainment system. In fact, a heat pump is not even a separate pump component. It is just extra plumbing to allow the air conditioning compressor to provide heat as well as cooling in the cabin. If you want to learn more about it, how much more efficient it is compared to the standard vehicles, and how exactly it works, we have made a very in-depth comparison video, so we will leave that link in the top right hand corner of this one. But long story short, it makes the biggest difference if you are running the HVAC at steady loads when the temperature counterintuitively isn't too cold. The next quirk of the i3 is that you may encounter cabin heating issues while rapid charging, so I came to the local McDonald's with some instable chargers to demonstrate. When I plugged in, even with this relatively high state of charge and no battery preheating, because with the i3 there is no preconditioning for rapid charging on demand, and without having driven it extensively, the charging power did climb up to eventually just under 50 kilowatts, which the i3 is rated for. And you can see from the OBD data that all of that power is actually going into the battery. However, the moment I hit the preconditioning button, and the preconditioning starts as indicated by the flashing fan symbol on the HVAC panel, the net power going into the battery drops by a few kilowatts. And that's because the charging port on the i3 is rated to take 125 amps. So even though the battery plus the heater could take a little bit more combined, because of the limitation of the throughput of the port, the heating robs some of the power which otherwise would have been going into the battery. And to be fair, this is the better of the two scenarios, because the battery temperature is still within reasonable numbers, about 20 degrees Celsius. You see, the traction battery can overheat in some scenarios when heating the cabin while DC charging, but that's a topic for another video. So just keep this in mind if you are doing long trips in winter and you are planning to stay in the vehicle while charging rather than having food, coffee, etc. Speaking of battery heating, while it's not implemented into the navigation system in the context of rapid charging, you can preheat the battery for departure, which can squeeze out maximum range in wintertime by not starting your journey with a cold battery. Even for this, there are some prerequisites. Number one, the i3 obviously has to be equipped with the high voltage battery heater. Believe it or not, this was optional in some markets, but it's very easy to spot. All cars which have the heated seats also came bundled in with the battery heating system. Secondly, the vehicle needs to be plugged into an AC charger with a departure time and climatization set. To do that, you go into the iDrive infotainment system and under My Vehicle, scroll down to Plan Charging/Climate Control. Here you go further down to set a departure time, in this case a one of 7 AM, and make sure that precondition for departure is set. The graphic implies preheating or pre-cooling of the cabin, like I've used during the rapid charging session, but if the car is confident that it has enough time to fully charge for a departure time and the temperature outside is cold enough, it will also start heating the battery up to a few hours in advance of your departure time, so the battery is nice and toasty for when you jump in the car and start driving. Realistically, I do not think most people should utilize this option unless you are desperate to squeeze out every mile of range, especially with the shorter range i3s like the 60 or 94 amp hour. With the biggest battery, it doesn't make that much of a difference, and realistically, keep in mind, even though you gain more range thanks to having a warmed up battery en route, you still had to pay for that energy to heat the battery up. So if you're just doing town driving, you are probably wasting a good few pounds every charging session just to bring the battery up to temperature. So in my case, I will leave it switched off. Okay, but you want to be nice and comfy for the beginning of your journey, or you do not want to scrape the windscreen of your car in winter. One of the biggest perks of having an electric car with on-demand heating. So, how do you precondition the cabin without preheating the battery? Well, if you use either the phone app or you assign the favorite button on your key fob to do the preheating, with those methods, regardless of whether the vehicle is plugged in, how much state of charge it has, etc., the preconditioning will only affect the cabin, and vice versa. There is no way to remotely preheat the battery pack. What you may have noticed, if I press the preheating button on the fob, in this case again, the HVAC comes to life, you've got the flashing fan symbol. It always defaults to the same settings, and that is about 22 degrees Celsius in automatic mode. So you don't have to worry about setting the car to cool in summertime versus heat in wintertime. However, like I mentioned in the beginning of the video, if you are waiting for someone while the preconditioning is running and you have your jacket on in winter, the cabin can get too hot. So how do you alter the temperature? To do that, you just need to turn on the ignition. You don't even need to put your foot on the brake pedal, and that brings the controls to life. And these will affect the target temperature, but the high voltage heating is still running. I'm pointing that out because if you turn on the ignition without having your foot on the brake and the car not being in ready state, it behaves like a combustion engine BMW, where the panel lights up and you can adjust some of the settings, but they are all practically just controlling the fan because the high voltage system is not active, and it's the high voltage which powers both the heating and the air conditioning. This is just a bit of a quirk from carrying over most of the software architecture from existing combustion engine BMWs, but this is sorted on newer electric BMW products like the iX, i4, etc., where the moment you jump in the cabin, the high voltage system comes alive, just like in, for example, a Tesla, and you can control the HVAC immediately, even without having the car in ready to drive mode. Okay, what if you tried absolutely everything, all the different settings, but you are still not getting heating in the cabin? Or you are just getting intermittent heat. Sometimes you start driving, the heating comes on, sometimes you precondition, it's fine, but at other times you come to a frozen ice block of a vehicle when you thought the preheating was running. Or even worse, when you jump in, you crank the heat, but there's only cold air coming out of the vents. I'm afraid I don't want to use the word common, but heating issues are fairly regular, and they always pretty much come from the same problem, which is a broken high voltage cabin heater. It essentially looks like a glorified kettle which heats up coolant, which then passes through a heat exchanger and a fan blows past it to get the heated up air into the cabin. If you want a definite confirmation that this is the problem, we can remotely diagnose your i3, and even with no error messages present in the user-facing side, we can see it as a fault code logged in the vehicle's memory. Now comes the bad part, because I'm afraid the only solution is to replace the entire part, and it's quite expensive at almost £1,000, including VAT. The good news is that it's not too much labor, and we can do it right on your driveway. So if you're experiencing any trouble, don't wait for the weather to get worse. Get in touch with us ASAP and get a slot in the diary booked. The last setting, which may not be obvious at a glance, we haven't touched on, is the automatic air recirculation. Just like with most cars, if you are driving behind a smelly diesel, you can go into manual air recirculation mode, which means that the car will keep reusing the cabin air instead of intaking in fresh air from the outside. It only does this for a certain period of time before it automatically switches off to avoid issues like humidity and gas buildup. But just like almost everything else, there is also an automatic mode denoted by the A symbol, which is how I personally always keep my HVAC set up. The HVAC system decides whether to pass the outside air in or whether to block it off based on the information from the AUC sensor. That's a German abbreviation for automatic air recirculation sensor, which lives just underneath the base of the windscreen. Due to the way it works, by heating up a surface, which then measures the pollutants in the air, it will eventually die, and the only solution is to replace it. The good news is that it's not particularly expensive, it's a very quick job, and if you feel like it, you can even do it yourself, as no coding or diagnostics are required. Having said that, a scan is helpful in the early stages to confirm the fault, because just like with the heater, there are no user-facing error messages, but you will notice that even in the automatic air recirculation setting, if you drive through a polluted environment, the car will default to taking in that outside air, and this is logged as a fault in the vehicle's memory. And I think that's it. Hopefully you learned something new. If that is the case, make sure to hit the like button. If you want to learn even more about BMW i3s, make sure to check out our BMW i3 playlist. And if you want to learn more about EVs in general, definitely subscribe for more content in the future. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you in the next one.